Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, myself and Jack are going to be talking about the Ancient and Future cards that are going to be part of our Paradox Rift set on the 3rd of November. This is going to be in time for the first International Championships of the season, and this set looks absolutely incredible. Today we're just going to be honing in on the new trait mechanics of Ancient and Future and talking about how these combinations and these cards are going to be seeing play. But just straight off the bat, we have some really impactful stuff, and these are going to be making big waves in the format by the looks of things. So let's kick off with some of the Ancient cards, Jack.
Yeah, so these are, or the concept of these are quite similar to things like Rapid Strike and Single Strike. It's basically just an extra keyword that there will then be support for Ancient cards or Future cards, and they'll all sort of interact together. Some which will only interact with Future cards or Ancient cards, some that will be standalone cards, but also kind of lean into the sort of themes of these keywords. And yeah, we're going to talk about the trainers first because it's always good to have an idea of the support in these decks. Joe, as Joe mentioned, we already kind of knew about these. These were introduced to us at Worlds very, very briefly, but we actually have a bit more context now, and we've seen a few more trainers and a few more Pokemon here and there. So the first is Ancient Booster Energy Capsule. This is an Ancient tool card that says the Ancient Pokemon this card is attached to gets 60 HP, gets plus 60 HP, and recovers from all special conditions and can't be affected by any special conditions. So one of the themes of these Ancient Pokemon does seem to be that they have a little bit higher HP compared to some of the other sort of EXs or other Pokemon of their sort of relative stages. So that's further increased by this Ancient Booster Energy Capsule. That it really tries to lean into these Pokemon being quite tanky and being quite difficult to deal with. And this is a really, really cool tool. I think whenever we see tools like this, they're often quite popular. They're often sort of, we see them see play here and there. They're always a little bit more sketchy because of tool removal, meaning that your opponent can get rid of them on their turn and take multiple prizes. But plus 60 HP is a massive amount of HP, and if they're not able to deal with or have any tool removal or whatever, that's a really significant amount of HP. We already see Bravery Charm index at the moment, which is plus 50. So this is 10 more than the Bravery Charm index for Ancient Pokemon, which is really nice. And when they already have that sort of good foundation of high HP, it's going to be really, really good for trying to keep them in play for as long as possible. We then have Earthen Vessel. It's an item card that says you can only play this card if you discard another card from your hand. Search your deck for up to 2 basic energy, reveal them, and put them into your hand. So this is basically Professor's Letter, but with the downside of having to discard a card first. That's how strong Professor's Letter was back in the day, so that's kind of crazy that we're having to nerf this, and this is still a really, really good card. When we start to talk about some of the Pokemon, there's a lot of combinations between different types that you can see in Ancient decks, and that could be one of the big selling points of this Ancient mechanic. And that really, you can really smooth that over with Earthen Vessel. It's a very, very nice card. I think the fact it's universal as well, there's actually nothing to do with Ancient Pokemon on this card, which is really nice because I think this is going to be a pretty nice addition to a couple of other decks as well. We already see things like Irida searching for things like Energy Search in the Rapid Strike box and stuff like that. So any Irida decks that maybe want to have Energy Search or anything like that, it's just another nice tool to have that is universal but does have that Ancient tag in the top right-hand corner. And finally, Professor Sarda's Metal is a supporter card that lets you choose up to 2 of your Ancient Pokemon. For each of those, attach a basic energy from your discard pile to that Pokemon, and then if you do, draw 3 cards. So once again, it's one of these draw 3 card plus additional effect kind of attacks, and this one really, really reminds me of Melanie, of Welder, those kinds of effects that are always really, really strong. It's actually a little bit more akin to Welder, I think, because you're attaching to 2 different Pokemon, which is really strong. There's a little bit of inbuilt acceleration in a couple of the Pokemon as well. So you can have some very strong attacks going from as early as turn 2, perhaps, with the addition of Sarda's Metal in your deck, as well as just drawing some extra cards. So yeah, it's a very, very strong card. I think there's the fact that you're able to search for different energy as well means that, again, if we're looking to an archetype where you're really looking to play into sort of type coverage and that kind of stuff, you're really going to be able to, between Earthen Vessel and Sarda's Metal, you're going to be able to really smooth over your attachments quite well and make sure you're attaching to the right things and have all the relevant energy you need. So yeah, very, very strong set of cards. I think very impressive, and I can see them all sort of fitting into an ancient deck that, really tries to capitalize on key weaknesses and, have big, bulky Pokemon that are difficult to take out in the active position.
Yeah, definitely agree. Metal is a really, really good card, and Vessel obviously combines with it, gives you extra discard in the deck naturally. Let's get on to some of the Pokemon then. And Jack's already sort of alluded to the fact that we could be having this sort of multi-type deck going along here. And that's because we have some really interesting Darkness-type Pokemon, which we know is a very relevant type right now, with Mew and Gardevoir roaming around. And we have Fighting-type Pokemon, which can be very relevant into the Rise of Lightning decks very recently, actually, which is quite interesting. So, first of all, we have the Roaring Moon EX. This was announced at the World Championships. It has 230 base hit points, so could go all the way up to 290, which is a really big threshold, especially because we know that so many decks have been trying to hit that crucial 280. That's been the number over the last year or so, and now we're seeing something that can push above that and cause more question marks of a number of different cards that may be now slightly out of range of a KO, which is massive. And then it has 2 attacks of its own here. The Frenzied Gouging attack for 2 dark and 1 colorless knocks out your opponent's active Pokemon. If your opponent's active was knocked out in this way, you do deal 200 to yourself. So there are risks to this attack, but in general, we've seen that this text of cleanly knocking out your opponent's active is very powerful right now. Lost Zone Giratina is one of the best decks in the game, and part of that is because you can knock out even, 330 hit point EX Pokemon. And Gouging can do the exact same thing. There can be situations where you power up Roaring Moon EX all in one turn with the help of, Professor Sada and with Dark Patch in the format. This could happen quite easily, I think. And if you're, taking the last couple of prizes of the game, it doesn't matter that you're damaging yourself. If you're in multi-prize versus multi-prize matchups, it also particularly doesn't matter all that much. All it really forces is that, well, it enables your opponent to come in with possibly like a little one prizer and really just poke you to finish you off, if that makes sense, and force you to find boss's orders on a future turn, which might be a little bit awkward, but I really think this is powerful attack text, especially because we also have the Calamity Storm option, which can be very good at getting through smaller things and even just like evolving V Pokemon or other EXs that you could be hitting into, where we deal 100 damage, then we can discard a stadium in play. If you do, this attack does 120 more damage. So far, the ancient Pokemon, as an archetype, doesn't look too vulnerable to Path to the Peak, but even if it does start having some ability-based Pokemon, having this attack that can discard stadiums naturally, like we've seen Lugia have, is a really nice thing just to open up things like Luminion and stuff in the late game for you. And yes, you probably need to play stadiums of your own, so the deck is filling up with probably the tool cards, probably with the stadiums in here as well. But remember, we are probably going to be a basic deck, so we should have the room to be able to play all these combination cards. And dealing 220 is a really good number. We even have the Brute Bonnet, which we'll come on to, that can increase that damage output via poison as well. So yeah, it seems to do very well into single prizes, evolving and other EX Pokemon in sort of a racing capacity, and has the Frenzy Gouging for when we're having to get through VMAX Pokemon or just Stage 2 EXs. So it covers every sort of angle, which is absolutely massive. So yeah, Roaring Room, I'm a really big fan of.
Definitely. Sandy Shocks EX is the next one. Sandy Shocks is a 220 HP fighting type EX that has the Magnetic Absorption ability. Once during a turn, if your opponent has 4 or fewer prize cards remaining, you may use this ability. Attach a basic fighting energy card from your discard pile to this Pokemon. Then the attack for 2 fighting and a colorless is Ground Spike that does 200. And during your next turn, this Pokemon can't attack. So this is basically a really nice Pokemon in terms of typing. Obviously, that fighting typing that Joe mentioned is really good into all of these lightning archetypes, which is great. But also the fact that it's sort of self-sufficient is really nice. You're able to bench your Sandy Shocks, use the ability, use a Sada, and attach an energy for turn, and you're able to get a Ground Spike going from basically nothing. Now, it's a lot of combo pieces, but the fact that you can do this in one turn from nothing is really good. And 4 or fewer prize cards remaining, there's still enough turns in the game for you to be able to use a couple of Sandy Shocks throughout the game and really accelerate the amount of energy you have. Or the amount of energy you're able to get onto the board and start sort of streaming Sandy Shocks. Now, this definitely does feel a little bit weaker than Roaring Moon. I think this is probably realistically just going to be in here primarily for type coverage. But the fact that you're able to play this type of Pokemon in the deck for type coverage, and it be relatively self-sufficient is really important. A lot of the time, that's kind of what dictates whether random tech inclusions of specific typed Pokemon will come into the deck or not. That's kind of what indicates whether they're going to be strong enough, and how many resources you have to put into actually getting them into play. And like I say, the fact that Sandy Shocks pairs so well with the cards that we're already putting in the deck, but also again, it's self-sufficient in terms of that extra energy you need, really makes it like a nice appealing option in terms of trying to just be able to bench them and get them up and running quite quickly. You can also bench multiple and start using that the like multiple abilities, so you're not too worried about other sort of hand disruption cards, Roxanne, Iona, whatever, because you're able to just manually, or you're able to just accelerate your energy through your ability and not have to worry about finding extra attachments or anything like that if you're able to get them down early enough as well. So yeah, really, really nice Pokemon in terms of self-sufficient sort of acceleration. 200 is like an okay number. It's not quite hitting that 220, 230 range, which is where we want to be hitting for EXs and evolving Vs and stuff like that. But the fact you have good type advantage and you're basically, two-shotting everything, you're able to close or seal off KOs that maybe Roaring Moon hasn't been able to deal with earlier, or some of the other attackers we have. You are also able to, as Joe mentioned, pair it with the Brute Bonnet that we'll talk about momentarily to push it up to 210. So it's almost there. I feel like the damage is a little bit sort of under where it needs to be, but I think the versatility of the card and how much it sort of runs on its own, you don't need to worry about it too much, is just a great sort of asset to the deck, and is really going to be something that is definitely nice to not have to worry about continuing to find things like Sada and stuff as well throughout the game.
Yeah, there's a chance that there's just going to be a pure darkness build, but this could end up being a type coverage / easy to power up, like more self-sufficient card. Could also just be good in like other fighting decks. We've seen that like the Tinglus and stuff, they fall off super hard if your opponent starts taking early knockouts, and having something that can just sort of power up on the bench whilst you turn attached to other things could be pretty solid. So yeah, it's like a decent card. I think the Roaring Moon, like you said, is the stronger option. Brute Bonnet seems really cool as well, though. Another reason to be playing these capsules in the ancient-based builds. You're a 120 hit point basic with the Toxic Powder ability. Once during your turn, if this Pokemon has an ancient booster attached, you can make both active Pokemon poisoned. Obviously, if you have your own booster capsule on your active Pokemon, or if you move out of the active quite easily, then you're removing that status condition. So it is relevant to have a booster capsule on your active Pokemon as well if they're ancient Pokemon, which is very solid, and it can help out with Roaring Moon, certainly, to hit that 230 threshold, which is really nice. And it could even improve your Rampaging Hammer attack, which does 120, and during the next turn, this Pokemon can't attack. So it's good enough to beat stick through other single prize Pokemon. With the help of Poison, you can get through like Radiant Greninja and stuff, for example. So it seems like a very relevant card. I think it will definitely go alongside Roaring Moon, because you're already having similar attack costs. You're probably already playing those patches and whatnot. So having a Pokemon that can offset the prize trade does seem pretty relevant to me. We've next got Screamtail. It's a 90 hit point psychic type ancient Pokemon. It's got Slap for 1 psychic, just as 30, and then Roaring Scream for psychic colorless does 20 times the amount of damage counters on this Pokemon to one of your opponent's Pokemon. So we can get 8 counters on this pretty easily, just with God of War EX, of course, and then we're dealing a 160 damage snipe, theoretically. Now, I think this is difficult to fit into God of War, and I don't think we can really commit too much more in the deck. We've seen that like Drifloon combos haven't worked out too much, so I don't really expect a Screamtail plus Capsule-based build would end up making the space in God of War, but this could be a relevant card, and if we do get that gym promo that can heal some psychic Pokemon, it could make Screamtail that little bit better, where you increase that snipe pressure to then be knocking out things like Luminion at the very least. So I think it personally doesn't go into God of War, but having that spread option is pretty relevant. At the moment, they just have Cresselia, which is a much lower damage output spread. And then the final single prize one, the Slitherwing, is one of the least impressive. You can discard the top card of your opponent's deck for a fighting, and then for 2 fighting you have 120, and this does 90 damage to itself. Your opponent's active is now burned. Yeah, it doesn't seem that valuable. We have more efficient attackers that we could be playing, and fighting's not the most viable type right now, even though we can accelerate to this a little bit just via Sada. It seems to be so far the weak link for the ancient stuff. But overall, I think promising. And I think, obviously, most people are focusing on the future stuff, which we're also thinking is going to be the stronger build. But I think ancient is also going to be very, very relevant. I think we have very high hit point basic Pokemon that can hit single prize, multi prize Pokemon very, very easily and have relevant type coverage. So even though Future does steal the show, I'm also optimistic that Ancient will have its day and be relevant in the format as well.
Yeah. So onto the future stuff, and like Joe says, that stuff all seems really good. But then you look at some of these cards, and yeah, minds were blown. We've got the Future Booster Energy Capsule, which is the equivalent of the Ancient Booster Energy Capsule. It's a tool, and it says the future Pokemon this card is attached to has no retreat cost, and the attacks it uses do 20 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. So this, for future Pokemon exclusively, is a combination of Floatstone and Muscle Band, arguably two of the best tools that have ever been printed, combined into one tool, which is absolutely absurd. We've seen a couple of sort of small, very sub synergies, even as early as Worlds was announced, that future Pokemon liked to move around the board quite a lot. With the Iron Valiant that we'll talk about in a moment, that seemed to be a Pokemon that really liked to move around the board quite a lot. So already just the Floatstone part of it is insane. But then with some of the other cards revealed, and even just regardless of the other cards revealed today, the fact that you're just getting a free Muscle Band on top is absolutely absurd. The fact that some Charizard decks here and like at the moment will sometimes play things like Vitality Band is already crazy. This is already double Vitality Band. But even like this works against everything. You don't have to worry about what your opponent's playing. You like whether it's EXV, anything like that. It pushes some very, very relevant numbers for some very specific attackers that I think are going to make this card even better than it already was. It already could have been. It pushes you into some really, really important breakpoints. And the fact that it is also, whenever you need it to be, just a Floatstone as well is crazy. It basically means it's going to be very difficult to trap these future decks because they're probably going to be running realistically maybe even 4 of these. I think that's very, very likely, or there's a huge potential for that, just because of how good the tool is. It can go on, your bench sitters. It can go on your attacking Pokemon. It's just very, very strong. So yeah, I already feel like this kind of one-ups the Ancient tool. Yeah, very, very strong card. We then have Techno Radar, which is the item that is kind of the item equivalent. You can only play this card if you discard another card from your hand. Search your deck for up to 2 future Pokemon, reveal them, and put them into your hand. So this is very similar to, say, like an electromagnetic radar or something from the X and Y, not the X and Y, the Sword and Shield. No, the Sun and Moon era is what I'm going for. That was a very, very strong card. It searched for 2 lightning type multi-prize Pokemon. This searches for 2 future Pokemon. The fact you have to discard a card is very, very, it's not really a massive cost. We played things like Quick Ball, we play Ultra Ball. All of these are either more restrictive or cost more resources. This is costing the same as a Quick Ball, but getting you basically double like an Ultra Ball almost. You're getting, because you're going to be playing a lot of future Pokemon, you're going to be getting pretty much 2 Pokemon all the time. I haven't really seen too many Pokemon that you'd necessarily want to play in these decks that aren't future Pokemon anyway, but you still have things like Nest Ball and stuff like that if you really want to be able to find those. So yeah, an absurdly good card for trying to set up your board, which is really, really good in terms of, just making sure you get into the game. It's like extra VIP passes. It's just a very, very versatile card. And finally, we have Professor Turo's Scenario, which is a spiritual successor to AZ. Put one of your Pokemon into your hand, discard all attached cards. So there's not as many uses for this compared to Sada. I think Sada is the only place where we see, or the supporter is the only place where we see the ancient cards trump the future cards here. But it's still a very, very strong card. AZ is a very powerful effect. It was while it was in format, and it still would be today. We've seen plenty of scoop up style cards do very, very well. This pairs quite well with some of the future Pokemon we've already seen. Like I say, they really like to move around the board, and technically picking one up and putting it into your hand is very similar to retreating or whatever. Maybe you can activate additional abilities because of it, things like that. But also, I expect this to be quite an impactful card if we do start to see any decks that try to build on sort of a tanky archetype. Now, I think with things like Roaring Moon and some of the cards we're going to talk about momentarily, it might be a little bit difficult to build tanky archetypes, but this is the kind of card that these stalling archetypes like to see. So another very versatile card, and this is the one that's not limited to just future Pokemon. It just has that future text. So if we ever have sort of any future tutor, maybe that's when we'll see it in these future decks. But I think in general, this is going to be one that has a little bit of a wider use. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether this revitalizes any of these tanking archetypes, or whether some of the cards we've already revealed and we're going to talk about shortly actually already just put a stop to that.
So let's get on to the Pokemon then. And I think these two EXs are exactly why me and Jack were in such a hurry to talk about the future and ancient Pokemon. We love the two future EX Pokemon. I'm going to start off with Iron Valiant EX. This one was revealed at the World Championships, but we have a lot more context now, especially with the future capsule. 220 hit points, Psychic type, with the Tachyon Bits ability. Once during a turn, when this Pokemon moves from your bench to your active spot, you may put 2 counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon. This is an extremely versatile and powerful ability. Now that we have good future Pokemon search from the little item that we got there, we could potentially get multiple Iron Valiant out early and shove in a ton of switch carts, switches, ropes that we've seen, already in like Lost Zone variants, and we can get a lot of counters on our opponent's Pokemon very early. I'm a little bit worried about Iron Valiant and its potential to pop off with early like Medicham plays, and just in general taking early knockouts on evolving Pokemon. It might make some 60 hit point Pokemon just irrelevant in the format. It's going to start challenging the Comfey engines and stuff like that. I think it drastically changes the playable decks in format just because of this ability alone and the sort of pop-off potential this has. I think this should not be underestimated in any way, shape or form. And on top of that, you can simply put these counters on your opponent's active Pokemon and increase Laser Blade's attack that does 200 damage for 2 Psychic and a Colorless, and you can't use this attack next turn, but who cares, because you give yourself free retreat. With the tool as well, you go up to 220 naturally. Those 2 counters on top means you're even getting through, like the Dragonites, the Roaring Moons of the world, the high hit point Pokemon, the Iron Hands. So, yeah, it seems like a really good damage threshold. It makes me think it could immediately go into Gardevoir. You give yourself a 3 energy attacker that can hit 220. That would also probably be good in the mirror match, because you can place counters on things and maybe finish off Pokemon that have been heavily damaged. It can go very easily into Lost Zone box, because we already know Psychic Energy are rife within these decks because of Sableye. And you open up the option to gate onto this attacker and have extra counters that would make Sableye even more dangerous. Now you could be knocking out things like an Archeops in a turn, a Radiant Greninja in a turn with Sableye, plus the Tachyon combination. So it already seems to go into a couple of archetypes that we know very well. And even though there isn't much natural future acceleration, because there's just so much versatile acceleration already in the format, I'm not worried about this card. I think it's going to be very good, very splashable. I also think that Town Store is already just very good in Lost Box, so even if you just play one of the Future Capsule in a Town Store, plus 1 or 2 Iron Valiants, that seems very powerful. It seems to be possibly better than Dragonite that was already in the deck as your beat stick, but then has the upside of having these counter sneaky placements throughout the game. So it just seems to be a massive upgrade on what we already have in some of the best decks in the format, and I think it drastically changes the game just on its own. Do you have anything else on Valiant? Because I know it's super versatile.
Yeah, no, I think, like you say, I think between that and what I'm just about to talk about, it really does change the dynamic of the format. And I think that I actually feel like Iron Valiant's gone a little bit under the radar since Iron Hands has been revealed. Because obviously we already knew about Valiant, and Iron Hands is kind of the new thing that we're talking about, and I understand that. But like you say, I think it's not an ability to be slept on. And I think the fact that it can go in 2 of the best decks already, and how they're going to look going forward, maybe we'll need to look at that regardless. But just like you say, how versatile this is, the fact this is essentially a 220, this deals 220 in Gardevoir, I think is something that if there's anything that deck is missing, it's maybe that is the fact that you just need a turn 2 tempo attack that isn't reliant on you getting your stage 2 out and reliant on getting a lot of energy along with your stage 2 out to be able to attack with Zacian. So very strong card. But yeah, that was revealed at Worlds, and we were already a little bit nervous about how these low HP Pokemon were going to deal with that. And then they dropped Iron Hands EX on us yesterday, and my goodness me, I think this card almost broke Twitter. It's absurd how strong this card is. I think it's got 230 HP. It's a Lightning type EX Pokemon. The first attack, Arm Spike, does 160 damage for 3 energy, already a semi-efficient attack. But the real attack is Extreme Amplifier that deals 120 damage for 4 energy, 1 lightning and 3 colorless, very relevant cost, I'll explain why momentarily. But it has the text, if your opponent's Pokemon is knocked out by damage from this attack, take 1 more prize card. Now we've seen this time and time again, and admittedly it's not always been broken, but multiple times this has been absolutely absurd. Stoutland, ADP, any of these kinds of effects that anyone has played with in recent memory, they will probably not have fond memories of this kind of text. And I think we're going to be in the exact same position before. Now, this is a 4 energy attack cost, and I think that is probably the minimum they could put on this, because it's absolutely absurd in terms of the amount of damage it does already. 120 is a huge amount of damage. So you're basically always going to be taking prizes on low HP, sort of one prize Pokemon. So this is basically, you're never worrying about Stoutland having enough energy or anything like that. You're always going to be taking 2 prizes on small evolving basics, which is very, very relevant. But 120 plus the damage from the capsule pushes you up to 140, which is, with weakness, then dealing enough damage to knock out things like Pidgeot, things like Lugia, things like Palkia for 3 prize cards, which is absolutely absurd. Now, yes, some of them can play Dunsparce and things like that, but if you're playing things like Iron Valiant, they're going to be scared to put these Dunsparces down because the Tachyon bits are going to be taking out little HP Pokemon like that. You can even gust up the Dunsparce and deal with it. This has 230 HP, so this is a tanky Pokemon itself. It's not particularly frail. It's, your opponent's still going to have to work to try and get a KO on this. And not only that, it's a great type. It's a lightning type, which means it can be perfectly splashed into Miraidon. And I think one of the scarier parts of Miraidon, we even saw it this weekend, is the fact that its Lost Zone matchup can be a little bit sketchy. The fact you have to take 6 prizes against them sometimes is a little bit scary, and often their 2 prize Pokemon will just be trading into you. Now you have an uptrade at some point during the game, which is very, very strong. You have things like Generator, you have Flaffy, you have manual attachments to be able to just attach this and get this set up out of nowhere. Great search in terms of being able to find it early with Miraidon. This can come down, so this can be attacking as early as, I think, turn 2 with a couple of lucky generators here and there, and really start putting the pressure on early, which is quite scary. It also can be a very strong late game card in combination with things like a Judge and a Path and that kind of stuff to try and make it difficult for your opponent to deal with this Iron Hands EX to try and take 2, maybe 4 prizes and win the game that way. So very, very strong in the Miraidon deck. But something that I really haven't seen many people talking about is the fact that I think this is actually also very viable in Lost Box, which is even scarier to me. The fact that we saw a Raihan build of Lost Box do well this weekend in Pittsburgh. It was a top 16 placement by Nicholas Moffat, playing double Raihan. And Raihan in combination with gates and energy attachments means, again, you can set this up out of nowhere. You're already playing lightning energy in these Lost Box decks. It's 3 colorless energy, so it really does not matter what other energy you're playing. I think there is an absurd amount of versatility to this card. And whether they're going to see you play in the same deck, I don't know, but just between these 2 cards alone, I think these are absolutely meta-shifting cards. They will warp this game, and I think we are going to be in a very, very scary format for single prize Pokemon. But not only that, like I say, the fact that you're still dealing double damage to some of the key Pokemon in this format, like Palkia, Lugia, and Pidgeot, makes this card even scarier, because it's not just the sort of Stoutland. Stoutland was very much like a single prize beat stick in the Lugia deck. That's not the case with Iron Hands. It can also not only be evenly trading, but trading up into these Pokemon as well, which is absolutely absurd. I think this card is overtuned to anything. I think the fact that it's weak to fighting is maybe the only thing that keeps it a little bit tame, just because Lightning does look to be getting much better. It had a very successful weekend this weekend, and I think it's only going to be going from strength to strength. So we may see a few more fighting decks here and there, or a few more fighting techs here and there to make it a little bit easier to deal with. But even the fact that you're dealing 120 damage and 140 with the tool means that you're going to be able to trade into these techs that are coming into you as well. So yeah, this card is absurdly overtuned. The 4 retreat doesn't matter because of the tool. I don't think there is a single thing to not like about this card in terms of stats or anything like that. Now, card design wise, there's a whole another conversation that you can have in the comments, but I think this card is genuinely one of the best cards they've ever printed in terms of the stats. Just with the support it has around it, there's nothing to sniff at, to be honest.
Yeah, it's been so pushed. I also think that Arm Spike is like super underrated. It's a very efficient way through the Lugias into like single prize matchups. If this is your like turn 1 power up as Miraidon, you can just sit with an Arm Spike, take a prize, know that you're very likely to tank, and then you have Amplifier for the next turn. There's just like so much like about the combination of the 2 attacks. It just seems to tick so many boxes. There are also some future little basics. These seem a little bit less relevant. Iron Bundle is a spiritual reprint to a Manaphy that we've had in the past. where if this is on the bench, you can switch your opponent's active Pokemon to the bench. They get to choose. Calm down. And if you do, you discard this Pokemon and all attached cards. So it's a little bit less recyclable than the Manaphy, but it's a nice way to force your opponent's Pokemon out of the active position, which can be pretty nice. Its attack isn't all that relevant. It hits for 80, and if the defending Pokemon's an evolution, they can't attack during the next turn, but we know there's a ton of switching in the format, so not too big of a deal. And the future Pokemon, one thing that's kind of against them is that you have to find a way to accelerate to these Pokemon, so they are a little bit more deck specific. Iron Moth has 130 hit points, it's a fire type, has the thermal reactor ability. When this Pokemon moves from the bench to the active, you may move any amount of fire energy from your other Pokemon to this, but its damage output isn't all that relevant. For Fire Colorless, you deal 120, and it can't use Heat Ray next turn. So even with the tool, you're only doing 140, and that's not really a great deal of damage. Maybe it's like a single prize tech card in like a Charizard EX deck, but I really don't feel like it's all that worthwhile. The only one that's a little bit interesting is this Iron Jugulus. It's a colorless Pokemon, obviously a basic, has 130 hit points, and has the Homing Heads attack for 3 colorless. It deals 50 damage to 3 of your opponent's Pokemon that have any damage counters on them, and this could be part of that sort of Iron Valiant Trixie Gate deck, where we can do a number of Tachyon bits and then finish everything off that we've damaged with Iron Valiant for a multiple spread option. Obviously, there's going to be Manaphy in the format. That's not going to change, I don't think. But Manaphy is low enough hit points that we can try like a Yoga Loop thing and then go into this attacker possibly as well. So could be a challenge potentially to Lost Zone Box. That's what I'm really thinking. So it may end up being a tech card for that reason. It also has the Bion Beam for 5 colorless, you deal 150, but if it has a future boost capsule attached, it's only for 3 colorless. So it would be a 170 damage attack for 3 colorless, which is actually pretty efficient for a single prize Pokemon. So again, it's going to be probably a little bit convoluted, but there could be a world where this makes it into an Iron Valiant Lost Box, which then becomes like a tech in the mirror kind of thing. So I feel like the EXs are the highlights for the future stuff, and these are going to be bit part players, the single prizes, but at least pretty interesting. And being an all colorless attack means at least Hydreigon is going to be like splashable potentially as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think everything that's been revealed over the past couple of days is absurd. We haven't done our first impressions of the Raging Surf set yet, just because we were in Japan when it first came out, but we're going to be doing that next week because we will have a full set by then, so it'll be a bit more in depth. But that set already looked very strong with Garchomp EX and Goldengo EX looking to be very interesting archetypes. Nowhere near as strong as these, but still very, very interesting archetypes, and looked to introduce a couple new decks to the format. But I think those 2 cards, in combination with everything revealed so far, sets up for an incredibly impactful November set. I think this is going to change the landscape of the decks in format. I think that we can easily see a massive meta shift in terms of what's popular, what changes, new archetypes coming in, and old archetypes really getting pushed out of favor. We've even got some other very impactful cards, things like the Jirachi, that will potentially be changing things as well. So yeah, this Paradox Rift set, I think, looks like one of the strongest sets we've had in a very, very long time. I think there's so many aspects to it, and it feels like we've only just had that with something like the Paldea Revolved set. So yeah, so far Scarlet and Violet has had some incredibly impactful sets, and I think this is one of the best blocks we've ever seen, to be honest.
The big thing for me is just how many decks that we know that are in the format right now are immediately challenged. Like, I think Lugia immediately has its haunches up because of Iron Hands. I think Lost Zone Box gains pieces, but also is scared of a lot of these new combinations. I think Gardevoir's scared of Iron Valiant as well, and even Iron Hands. I think Mew can be scared of Roaring Moon, and Charizard can be scared of Roaring Moon, these sorts of things. So yeah, like every deck that's currently in the format is being challenged by these new ancient and future Pokemon, which means they're probably going to be hitting the ground running and being super relevant cards in the format.
Yeah.
Right, that rounds things out. We really wanted to talk about the ancient and future stuff because we've just had so many ideas already about them. So we thought we'd get this out early. But there, like Jack said, will be some first impressions coming soon. I also need to do a 151 content coming out soon as well. There's going to be a set review and whatnot very soon. So keep an eye out for the community review that's coming. So yeah, plenty of cool stuff on the channel. Thanks for watching, and let us know what you think about these cards and if there are any combinations that we missed that you think are going to be powerful. So cheers.